The legend of the vampire actually goes back for centuries, and it exists in some form or another in almost every culture. In fact, some people believe the first vampire story was in the Bible. But for most of us, we imagine vampires lurking in the woods, preying on small towns and villages in those hours between dusk and sunrise. Why did people believe they had so much power, and did they really exist? We went in search of the truth. Under the cloak of darkness they come, legions of the undead, rising from their graves to prey on the innocent. Or, at the very least, to invade and captivate our imaginations. The vampire, reinvented in stories, legends for centuries.
I am Dracula.
And even today, they're back again.
Stay away from me.
This time as lovesick, romantic, and just slightly dangerous.
Vampire.
The Twilight series has created an almost cultish following among tweens.
They want the vampire to be glamorous and romantic now. They don't want a monster that they can't relate to. They want to see that human side of the vampire.
Anne Rice, the best-selling author of what is widely considered the first modern vampire novel, says the notion of vampires is almost irresistible to the human psyche.
The vampire is just a powerful metaphor for the outcast in all of us, for the monster in all of us, for the predator in all of us.
Vampires, the stuff of nightmares, legends, and myths, but is there now proof, or at least evidence, that something was going on? These 16th century remains of a 60-year-old woman just uncovered near Venice show a brick in the skull. In 1966, a small town outside of Prague was the site of a major discovery. 14 skeletons were found, their mouths filled with stones and sand and their heads cut off. Why did they do all of these things to the bodies?
To prevent them from coming back and biting someone.
But the bones, say experts, only proof of fear and ignorance.
There were so many reasons that were purely biological, pathological really, about how a body decomposes that was misinterpreted as being signs of a body having a life after death.
When you say vampire, you almost always think of Romania and Count Dracula. But in fact, Bohemia, or today's Czech Republic, was critical to the rise of the vampire legend. Almost every cemetery in Prague is teeming with stories. One favorite story about the no-name vampire buried here who lured victims with his music.
He begins to gather a crowd, and over time, people would notice that neighbors were still disappearing. And they never knew if the sounds were of the accordion or actually his victim's screams.
Small towns and villages struck by disease and death were breeding grounds for vampire lore.
Everything from a crop failure to the plague to infant mortality would be explained away by one of these tales, something like The Vampire Did It.
Did vampires exist? One thing we know for certain is that the legends will live on.
The vampire will always be a character with whom we somehow identify in our own mortality and in his or her immortality.
The vampire is never going to go away. There will be more and more revivals. We're going to have continued romance with the vampire.
And of course, it's a romance that's also become a tourist bonanza, and not just in the graveyard tours in the dark forests of Eastern Europe, but also in the small town of Forks, Washington, the setting for the Twilight series and the movie. That small town is now seeing 100 tourists a day. Our fascination with the undead seems as strong as ever.
All right, and our thanks to Claire Shipman. You can check out our slideshow of vampire movies through the years at abcnews.com.